So I work at the University of Bristol on a project that's been running for about 2 years, which is working, it started off being broadly about advice, it became focused particularly on citizens' advice. My bit of it, which is looking at the work of advisors, the emotional labour deployed and carried out by advisors, is focusing particularly on debt advice. So it's somewhere between these first two perspectives. There are lots of things, so I'm going to say the things that I find really interesting from this report, and then two questions that I had from it. But start off by saying a bit about how it intersects with our projects. I think the reason I'm interested in debt advice as opposed to other areas of advice is because it does bring up, and I think this is made clear, how kind of emotionally fraught it is in compared to other areas, and how kind of emotionally complex it is. And so one of the things the report brings is this wealth of emotional complexity from the advisor's point of view, that the client, which is also used in citizens' advice, the client is coming into the room with, the room being its own kind of space that's set up and framed in a particular way. But this question of what is the client presenting with? And there's a lot of really interesting things brought in this report. So it's emotionally fraught, but also emotionally rewarding from the point of view of advisors. If you ask what's the most kind of satisfying moments for advisors, it's often the point at which someone comes in over-determined by shame, by anxiety, by all of these kind of symbolic things brought up about letters, piling up beneath the letterbox, and then leaves with that kind of weight lifted off their shoulders. And the thing that I often say to myself I haven't quite got to the end of is that, as I see it, kind of everything is about debt, and certainly in advice terms, a lot of things are about debt. Losing one's job is often a debt problem, family breakdown often becomes a debt problem, as it's brought up. But often debt is always about something else, as in the work of advisors. Often the kind of task is to clear a lot of this emotion away so that it can be dealt with, and that these things can themselves be worked upon. The things actually that's brought up just now, one interesting thing actually is that from looking at different bureaux across the UK, is how the trigger is different in many areas. And that the trigger, as in what pushes a manageable debt problem that someone is just about kind of ticking along, to something that becomes problematic is very different. And it's in rural areas, it's often the loss of a car is something that's brought up a lot. That actually once the car goes, if you have a problem with the car, then you can't get to work, you can't get the children to school, and all of these things suddenly fall apart. And then there's also practices of different creditors, but it's interesting how that trigger is quite kind of geographically distinct. I love this line about, you said in the report about linkages and entanglements, and for me that's really key, is the way in which debt inhabits all of these different areas, where it becomes entangled with objects, with items on hire purchase, with things that are susceptible to bailiffs, all of these things, the way it inhabits the day in particular ways, and those kind of complex entanglements I think are one level very difficult for advisors to deal with. Said the other thing. So the two themes that I thought were really interesting was one around time, and this interesting point about the past kind of contracting around around one kind of shameful event, whether it's the purchasing of the PlayStation or the loss of a job, and the way in which that kind of shame coalesces around this one moment, and how that inhabits or kind of overdetermines the soul, and obviously the future, and the different kind of. I wanted to ask about insolvency as well, but I'm interested in how the kind of horizons are imagined differently in different situations, how for many people there's no hope at all, and the future becomes this kind of fearful weight upon one's shoulders. So I think there's a lot of things about time in there that you link really nicely to the melancholia. The second theme is around relationships. Actually, on the time, I think there's something really interesting about in the report about how debt intersects with the life course, and how it seems to kind of upset these established kind of unquestioned notions of what the life course should be, and that in itself a kind of a shameful aspect of being in debt. And secondly, relationships. And it's interesting that for some people the debt was hidden from partners. In others, it becomes a disruptive element in the relationship. And again, it's this impossibility of assuming debt to be a personal problem that can be extracted from those relationships. And again, this is interesting in advice terms. And also there's another thing in there about the relationship with neighbours as well, and the kind of everyday relationships that compose daily life and how these become determined by debt as well. And it felt like there was a contraction into oneself as part of this, and leading to isolation and so on. The two questions that I had, actually, one was around insolvency, as you're saying, around the role of the debt relief order. I'm really interested in how that is described in these forums, whether it is seen as something that is a kind of fresh start, or is loaded with this kind of moral sense of failure. And actually the second is about the relationship between what's called priority and non-priority debts. Almost everything that's been discussed is what's called non-priority debts, consumer debts, credit debts, and so forth. The only priority debt that's raised here and there is council tax, not rent arrears. And I'd be interested in the intersection between housing, how all this intersects with housing in particular. And as you know, the things that are coming out today, as we have further benefit cuts, what the relationship is with priority debts. Is this immediately going to affect council tax payments? And is it about relationships with local authorities mainly? And how this can be brought together with housing struggles at the same time. Did I have anything else? I think that was it really. It'd be really interesting. It would be interesting to hear, particularly if there are other voices from the advice sector, as to the kind of broader political questions, Johnny, that you raised around debt relief, which I think are really important. I'd be really interested to see how that can intersect with the kind of everyday practices of advice and what links can be made there. So look forward to it. Thank you.